and welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, COVID, crisis management, supply chains, resilience, anything that's associated with those topics. Speaking of topics, if you'd like to be a guest on the show or you'd like us to talk about something, please feel free. You can reach me through LinkedIn. That seems to be the easiest way to find me. I am the only Alex Fullick on LinkedIn, so I'm really easy to find. Just send me a message and I reply to everything I get. And we'll see about getting you on the show or finding someone to come on the show and talk about your topic. Longtime listeners and viewers, you'll know that I talked about the BCI Virtual World Conference in November 2020 and that I was a speaker. And if I was lucky, I'd be able to get a few presenters to come on the show and talk about their topic and maybe talk a little bit more about other things. Today is one of those days. And the topic from the BCI conference is Managing the Unknowns, a practical guide to building supply chain resiliency. And I'd like to welcome the session presenter, Paul Raw. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to join you.
And just so everybody knows, the video is not being shown on Paul's side, so you'll have to look at this mug through the whole thing. Just for the for viewers, Voice America, it won't matter for the radio, but just so you're aware. Paul, we've got listeners and viewers around the globe. Can you take a minute or two and talk about yourself, what you do, and how you got into this?
Yeah, sure. I suppose my sort of early initiation and entry into the area of business continuity was as a military leader in the British Army. Sort of contingency planning, strategic planning is something that we practice and execute a lot in the military, and so it sets up the foundation for that sort of mindset and thinking in different environments and reacting and coming up with strategic plans as the environment and dynamics around us change. So I suppose that was the real foundation and the starting point. But when I left the British military, I was offered a job as a security consultant in the Middle East. And so I traveled down to the Middle East and I was exposed to that environment on a consultancy basis, but with a predominant focus on security related planning, risk identification and risk mitigation. But as you'll imagine, with the security environment, it's very competitive and densely populated by ex-military personnel and police service personnel. And so I sort of soon identified the need to firstly differentiate, but also to continue my learning. And so I engaged on a master's degree in disaster and emergency management. And that really exposed me to the wider field of resiliency planning, business continuity, crisis management in a sort of commercial environment. And so building on my existing security risk management knowledge and experience, that was the new direction that I took in my career. I was fortunate enough to travel around the world and be engaged in numerous different projects across different sectors and in different areas of the world. And then returned back to the UK, where I joined the British Standards Institution in my current role. I'm now a senior consultant for supply chain security. And within that scope, I look at not only supply chain security, but the wider field of risk management and building on that sort of knowledge and experience of business continuity and resiliency building.
So would it be fair to say, like many of us, you kind of fell into this? Went into it?
It was definitely a process of evolution. And it's interesting, if you look at sort of crisis management planning, it's sort of the start of the entire sort of field as a profession sort of evolved out of the end of the Vietnamese or Vietnam War in the US and the return of veterans coming looking for jobs and opportunities in the US market and identifying that really unique characteristic of being able to plan in and amongst changing dynamics and situations. And so I suppose I really followed that trend on my own sort of path of evolution and development, I suppose.
That's interesting. I'd not heard that piece about the Vietnam War and soldiers coming back with relation to supply chain and the planning and piece. I'd not heard that. That's rather interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they came back with an abundance of sort of skills and abilities that wasn't necessarily either identified or utilized in the commercial environment, and it soon sort of caught on because of the value they brought to the environment that they're entering.
Interesting. I never knew that. Learn something new every day. So your topic was supply chain management. There are different ideas about supply chain and the management of it and different pieces of it. And different people have had that have been on the show to talk about it before have had their own interpretations. How do you define supply chain management? What is that to you?
Yeah, well, the current environment with COVID-19 around the world, if people haven't sort of heard of business continuity and crisis management planning before, then they certainly have now. One of the areas which is really interconnected and has been affected by the current pandemic is that of supply chain management. And so if we talk of supply chain management, it's really, in its very simplistic terms, it's the movement of the flow of goods and services. And so if you think about it in a holistic view, it's the management process from essentially conception to consumption, and then even beyond in relation to goods and services. And so, if I break that down, if you think about the conception, whilst we're developing strategic plans in a global environment such as the one that we operate in a modern world, it's interconnected by its very nature. And so the idea of supply chain management really reaches into the conceptual design for strategic planning and building. And so as a supply chain manager or as a consultant in that field, we can really add value to organizations looking to develop strategies on a global perspective. But then if you think about the flow of goods all the way through the manufacturing process, the sourcing of raw materials, to the eventual end user. And I suppose the best way to break it down is to give an example. And so, if I use the example of a modern smartphone, for example, which most people have nowadays, if we think about the leading manufacturers of modern smartphones, the majority of the manufacturing takes place in the Far East, predominantly in China. But it's not actually manufactured in China. They're just putting component parts together into a finished package. The actual components come from all over the world. And so if we think about, continue that thought of a mobile phone, components come from Germany, China, Japan, Switzerland, USA, and over 40 different countries around the world. And so the supply chain management aspect is how do we manage that? How do we source them? How do we manage all of those players within that process? But not only the component parts, it also reaches into, the raw materials and how does that impact our business model? And so again, with a modern mobile phone, they contain elements such as, tin, tungsten, gold, cobalt. And these are known as conflict minerals. And so there's an entire element of management within your supply chain. If you're a big mobile phone manufacturer, consumers are very aware, and they're aware of issues such as conflict minerals, environmental impact, social impact. And so the responsibility is on the manufacturer to make sure they're sourcing materials ethically. I'll take the example even further. Rare metals, for example. Over 80% of rare metals come from China, 15% Australia, Russia 2%, and then the remaining 3 or so percent comes from the rest of the world. And it's also about managing that process. Byproduct of sort of manufacturing rare earth metals is the sort of creation of radioactive waste. And so how do we manage that process in relation to environmental impact or the social impact of the process and the footprint that we leave behind when we're building and selling that mobile phone? So just to take it one step further, I did say beyond the supply chain. So I'll give you an example. pharmaceutical industry, for example. Global worth of about $1.3 trillion, black market worth of approaching $1 trillion, certainly in the high hundreds of billions of dollars. And so there's a real sort of responsibility for pharmaceutical companies to manage their product through the supply chain and manage the risk of exposure to things like black market. So we help sort of pharmaceutical companies manage their risk profile for counterfeit goods. We help them dispose of spoiled products so that spoiled product doesn't enter the black market. So it's about taking a holistic approach to supply chain management, really identifying the start point and the end point for the products, the materials, and the impact of that process. And so that's I've got a rather long-winded answer for you.
So I've got a question for you then. Using your example of the phone and all the different pieces that come together, I'm manufacturing the phone. I pull all those pieces together. So I'm responsible, or should be, to make sure I'm getting all the supplies I need from the people that are required. Does supply chain management end with me, or does it also continue when I take that phone and now move it downstream to vendors and clients and people that I'm shipping to?
Yeah, I mean, it's widely accepted that we inherit the risk of our service providers. And so the responsibility is on you throughout the entire process, whether you're subcontracting services, whether you've got subcontractors who in turn have subcontracted. It doesn't matter whether it's 5 levels down the supply chain. If your organization is supporting, let's say, for example, exploitation of the human workforce in third world countries, then ultimately is your responsibility. And so, we also have a capability and do a lot of work in the sort of corporate social responsibility environment as well, looking at supply chains and how, developed world organizations have an impact in third world countries, and also, third world organizations within their own countries, and looking at that ethical and environmental impact of it. So yeah, the responsibility is on you as a manufacturer of a mobile phone to make sure that you are essentially enhancing the environment and the well-being of those involved in your supply chain, rather than taking from it and having a negative impact.
Okay, because I've talked to a lot of people, and sometimes it seems as though supply chain management ends when it comes to my door, but it doesn't. I'm just another piece in that whole chain, and I have to look at what comes in and what's going out to make sure that I'm not selling to the wrong people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about the use of sort of e-commerce, for example, and the ability of anyone to become a retailer or a distributor, then again, we have to manage that process. If you sort of carry on along the lines of the mobile phone, there are massive efforts with mobile phone manufacturers to make sure that they are using recycled materials in their products. Well, the best source of recycled material is from their own devices and their own phones. And so the process of recycling within their own cycle is a massive element of their business plan and business strategy. And, let's not forget the power of the consumer. What's ultimately driving this, as well as what we would hope would be the sort of the moral compass of global corporations. But the key driver is the consumer. Mm-hmm. And the massive awareness amongst consumers now for social economic responsibility, for environmental impact, ethical sourcing, and so on and so forth. And that includes, the end of use cycle for their goods and products.
And that, thanks to social media, a lot more people are aware on that level, because even, let's say, 20 years ago, you heard about some of this, but you only heard about it if it was something major and hit the headlines. Otherwise, I don't think a lot of people paid a lot of attention to it.
Yeah. And we do a lot of work for clients as well in the recycling process, because the black market, no matter what commodity we're talking about, is is derived and fed and enabled through crime, and crime is just one of the risk exposures that we have to manage and mitigate in our supply chains. And so we work with mobile phone manufacturers in their recycling process to make sure that those end of life cycle product for the first user doesn't become a source of crime or criminal activity or opportunity. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is way beyond the first user, all the way around to hopefully what we could develop into a holistic circular economic process.
I want to ask you what resiliency means to you, and what is resiliency in supply chain management? And I think you kind of touched on a little bit of that. But
yeah, it's a massive question, Alex. And to be honest, for all of my experience engaging with business leaders, if we put 5 or 10 business leaders in a room and ask them to define resiliency, I'm pretty certain every single one of them would come up with a different sort of definition of resiliency. I think, to be honest, if you put resiliency into a Google search, I think you come up with about 13 million different definitions. So that in itself sort of demonstrates that it's a real fluid concept. And to be honest, it's really, really relevant to the organization itself. So accepting that, and accepting that while we talk about a concept, it's very useful and valuable to have a handrail. What I'll do is I'll give you the definition for BS 65,000, which is the guidance for organization resilience and accepted international standards. So organization resilience is the ability of an organization to anticipate, prepare for, respond, and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. So if we take that as a very sort of rigid handrail for the discussion, what I think we need to do is extract the really important elements of it. And it's the element of being able to anticipate, prepare for, and respond. So there's a timeline element to your management process. It's also about the impacts of negative, not always negative, but largely negative events, and the ability of the organization to withstand and come out of that in a positive manner. And so, as I said at the beginning, it's really relevant to the organization itself, and it has to be tied to the sort of corporate and strategic goals of the organization, as well as the management structure and the values of that organization. But I would sort of encapsulate that in a ability to manage the impact of events proactively during an event and after an event, and for your organization to come out of that process in the most positive manner. When we talk about resiliency and crisis management, disaster management, and sort of all of those different areas, we quite often focus on the negative impacts of it, but there are also opportunities as well. And so when we're defining resilience, it's also important to at least understand and possibly reflect the opportunity aspect of that process as well. And I think it would be quite relevant.
Can you give an example? What a positive aspect would be?
Yeah, so if we think about COVID-19 now, the changing dynamics of supply chain, the changing route to market, the changing dynamics of consumers. For some organization, they will prosper in the new dynamics of, for example, e-commerce. If I take the UK at the moment, the retail high street is suffering terribly. And every week there are closures of different stores and retailers who haven't been able to weather the storm of, call it COVID, but actually the impact on the consumers and the ability or lack of ability for them to go out and shop in the high street. So those organizations who have changed their dynamic and adapted to an e-commerce model quickly have found new opportunities that they hadn't realized before. Now, they were forced into that strategic change because of the conditions that they found themselves, but there's an opportunity there for them to flourish. And supply chain management can be a really powerful distinguisher and competitive advantage for an organization if it's managed effectively. And so, that would be a very relevant and obvious example of how that changing dynamic can be an opportunity. Unfortunately, for the majority, it's difficult to see the opportunity while you're fighting fires in the meantime. But I can't remember who came up with the quote, but life is what happens while we're busy making other plans. And it's certainly relevant to business. And those people who are dynamic in their thought process, are agile in their organizational structure, and have the flexibility and the opportunity to change, there are greater opportunities out there for them.
So would I be correct in saying that the entire supply chain management, it's not just about what box is coming in my door?
No, absolutely not. Far from it. It's the end-to-end process, and that's one of the key sort of aspects that we talk about with business leaders, and that is sometimes overlooked by organizations. It's not just the simplistic movement of goods from point A to point B through, a distributor or a wholesaler or a manufacturing facility. It's the holistic approach to supply chain management, from, as I said, from the conceptual design of what your strategic plan is going to be for any particular commodity, service, or product that you're going to produce and distribute, all the way through that manufacturing process, all the way through to the consumer, and then beyond that. And so it involves all of the contractors, all of the subcontractors, all of the different environments, all of the different legislation, and all different aspects. And so it's really, really important for business leaders to really appreciate the full holistic dynamic of supply chain management. It's not just a straight line from point A through point B to point C.
So how do you, using your example, the entire end-to-end process and all the contractors, subcontractors, vendors, partners, et cetera, what happens when you take one of those key ones out because they've had a massive fire, a flood, a terrorist activity, and it impacts you? What part of supply chain management kicks in? Do you already have another partner waiting in the wings? Because I'm assuming with a lot of these people that you're working with, in supply chain management, you've got contracts and service level agreements or memorandums of understanding or whatever else you've got. How do you manage things when one gets pulled out for whatever reason?
Yeah, and that's exactly the business continuity aspect of the supply chain management process. So, one of the key drivers for the supply chain management process is risk management. And so risk management, including risk analysis, identification, prioritization of internal activities, prioritization of risks, threats, and vulnerabilities, and your exposure to them, but also doing the impact analysis side of things. And so as an organization goes through that process and they identify their key dependencies and vulnerabilities within the supply chain, then it's really important to mitigate those risks in a proactive manner. So yeah, we talk about sort of redundancy plans or alternate plans. And when we look at the various different risk and threat profiles, it's reasonably straightforward to identify the different dynamics and to come up with a strategic plan. So if you have, for example, let's take Hurricane Katrina in the US, 2005. If your supply chain came through that region of the US, the impact on your business was massive. But if you had an alternate supply route, which came in and maybe came from the other side of the planet and landed in the US in, I don't know, maybe the northeast coast, and completely bypassed Hurricane Katrina and the impacts and the lasting impact of that.
How do you find that out? Do you work with your key vendor to to identify with them who else you could deal with, or if they have alternative delivery routes?
Yeah, and yeah, vendor management is a massive part of it. And again, we talk to lots of business leaders, and to be honest, they don't always fully understand their supply chain. I'll give you an example. A fashion design retailer in the UK, it's a global brand, and we did a lot of work with them on their supply chain, their risk management, and they had some elements of their good that were produced in Turkey, and they were delivered to their distribution warehouse in the United Kingdom and the US and the Far East. Now, when we asked them, what is the supply chain for those goods coming from that particular supplier, they didn't really know. They didn't have transparency throughout the process. All they had done is contracted with the service provider to say, you can pick it up at point A and deliver it to point B. What they didn't know was that that contracted service provider was subcontracting it a number of fold throughout the supply chain. So it drove from Turkey to a port. The container was left at the port. It was picked up by another service provider, an unknown party to the fashion design company. It was then moved, put onto a ferry. It was unaccompanied on the ferry. It went across to Italy. It was picked up by another unknown service provider, put onto a rail network, transported across Europe, unaccompanied, unchecked, into Germany, where it was picked up by a road haulier, driven from Germany to the UK and delivered to the distribution warehouse in the UK. Now, that company did not have any idea that their cargo, which had suffered a number of losses throughout the supply chain, was unaccompanied for the majority of its transit from the source to the point of delivery. And so when we talk about identifying risks and managing the process, quite often it comes down to how do you manage your service providers and what is the transparency that you have across those service providers? Do you have legal contracts in place that says they must declare subcontracted elements of their service provision? Give transparency to who they subcontract to. Do you carry out your due diligence, site checks, risk analysis on those subcontracted services? So you've got a really comprehensive risk profile throughout your supply chain. Quite often, organizations don't do that. They'll have a contracted agreement with a service provider, and they might not look any further than that. If they do look further than that, it might go to the second sort of level of the supply chain, but not very often does it go beyond that point to get a really, really complex and holistic risk profile for the supply chain.
And then I assume you do you mentioned, going to maybe the second level, but all those different vendors, all those points you mentioned, from Turkey to Italy, Germany to the UK, all of those vendors, all of those service providers, whatever they're doing, you have to do the same kind of investigation as you're doing with the person who made those garments in Turkey, right? You have to use the same level of rigor, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go and visit sites, we'll interview service providers, we'll do sort of spot checks, we'll observe them, the way that they operate, we'll produce a complete analysis of that service provider and give it to our clients as part of the service we provide. Now, many companies will do that themselves in-house. It's not a complex process, but a common problem that we often identify is it's a question of resources and time, and sort of human resources and time. And quite often, either the supply chain or the business continuity or the risk management department within an organization is a handful of people, yet they'll have a global network. And so it's really, really difficult to stay on top of that supply chain. It's impossible with 5 people to continually review, assess, and report on a global distribution network of a number of different products if you've only got 2 or 3 people working in your department.
Now, let's say you find something wrong, let's say between, using the same example, between Italy and Germany. There's an issue with the person or the people, the company that moves the goods from one to the other. Do you approach them, or do you go to those people in Turkey and say, hey, we don't like the supply chain you have in place. We want you to change something. How do you address that?
No, we'll go back to our client. It's essentially what we're doing is we're empowering our clients to make effective decisions, and so their strategic sort of plan is something that we might be able to comment and advise them on, but we certainly don't make decisions or start disrupting the management processes or the strategic plan that they have in place. So yeah, we would go back to our client. We always give feedback when we're at the site. Yeah, this is an area of concern for me. This is an area of concern for the client. This is a vulnerability. Are you aware of that? And we engage at that level. But we report back, and then we advise and we help organizations make effective decisions. And the corporate drivers, unfortunately, don't sort of originate in risk management. It's generally it's about commerce. If it's not about commerce, then it's about corporate social responsibilities. So it's not for us to advise them necessarily on what changes they should make, but we certainly empower them to make effective decisions, and we help them during that decision process.
So they can turn around and say, go to their client, the one creating the garments, and say, we need a fix, we need an alternate, or whatever the case may be, right?
Yeah.
You give them the information, and then they make the determinations and decisions afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So
okay.
A typical process will be, let's have a look at your sort of legal contracts that you have in place with this service provider. What are they obliged to provide for you, and how are they performing in relation to that? Now, some contracts might not stipulate how they transit from point A to point B, and so therefore they might not be breaking any rules. So we'd advise the client, these are vulnerabilities that you have in your sort of contract process. So they can tighten up from that perspective. Or alternatively, if the contract, for example, is watertight and the service provider isn't complying with it, then we provide them with the evidence to go back and have those discussions. Now, it's unless there's a massive deviation, and bearing in mind that most organizations go through a process of due diligence before they actually assign a service provider in the first place.
Right.
So there's a certain level of capability that is there, and we accept is there. But in light of those deviations and the risk exposure, we would guide them on how they could possibly mitigate those risks. And generally, if you can fix a problem, ideally you identify it beforehand and you take a proactive approach and you mitigate the risk before they're actually exposed to your process anyway. But if we can help them mitigate those risks in a timely and cost-effective manner, then we'll help mitigate those risks. If it's simply not possible to mitigate those risks, the service provider doesn't have the capability, then we will advise the client of that, and they take the decision, and we help them implement whatever changes are needed within the supply chain.
And I was going to ask you about that upfront stuff, when you're determining who you're going to do business with, that you're already doing some level of due diligence. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Paul, you mentioned the upfront processes, when you're kind of determining who you're going to work with, as a partner or a vendor or something like that. How do you go about doing that? What kind of things do you look at? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off by giving you an example. So we were asked by a pharmaceutical organization to have a look at the different risks throughout the supply chain as they were looking to change from air freight to land-based freight between Europe and China for high-value pharmaceutical goods. With that came a number of different service requirements. So they need to have a controlled environment, and they needed to deliver goods in a set timeline as well, because there's an expiry date for the products they were moving. And so they came to us to ask for a review and insight into different risk dynamics that they would be exposed to throughout that process. So we've got a number of different tools that we use at BSI. We've got a screen tool which gives global risk profiles for different supply chains and routes throughout the world. And so we started with a tabletop exercise. If you're going to go land-based freight from Europe to China, it's going to be rail. These are the rail routes, and these are the different countries that you transit. These are the requirements, service requirements. So, for example, halfway through the route, as you enter in sort of Poland, there's a change of gauge on the rail network. So your freight needs to be transferred onto a new gauge. That will have a delay. How do you manage your goods? How do you secure them in that process? What are your sort of business continuity? We spoke earlier on about how do we manage the impact? Well, one of the key areas, as I said, was to do it proactively. And part of that risk process is to look at the different dynamics. So in that case, moving to a land-based transport, we identified a number of risks. So you're transiting through different countries. There are customs regulation, border requirements that you have to satisfy. What happens if you have a customs check or a customs hold at any particular border? Let's say, for example, on the border with Russia or Mongolia, if we wanted to take it to the more remote locations. Bearing in mind that you've got a temperature controlled, an environmentally sealed container, which has a generator on it, which requires fuel to make sure that the environment is maintained. What do you do, and what are your capabilities, and what are your resources if your container was to be lifted off the rail network, put into a customs hold so they could do a check? But how much fuel have you got? What happens if your reefer breaks down and the environment isn't maintained? What resources do you have to respond to that? And so by looking at those different dynamics and really doing a detailed analysis of the risk exposure, we can start to develop mitigation plans. Okay, so if we're going to go to rolling stock for Mongolia, let's identify a number of different service providers who might be able to help us mitigate the risk of A, B, or C. Or how quickly can we mobilize one of our own team of engineers to go and fix a refrigeration unit? What resources do they need? Can we package that into a small package that can be mobilized and dispatched quickly to reach remote areas of the world in order to maintain the environment and the conditions needed for our particular goods? And bearing in mind, some of these container loads can be worth hundreds of thousands, if not in excess of $1 million sort of dollars per container load. So it really justifies the mobilization of a small team of engineers or the agreements and service agreements in place for service providers, along that supply route. So that's an example of a proactive approach to identifying and managing risks throughout the supply chain.
And all that is before you actually working with somebody on the far end.
Yeah,
You're identifying all that all the way along, right?
Absolutely. That was a key part of the decision process of, do we move to land-based distribution or do we maintain the air freight? And so the analysis and the feedback and the contribution we made to that process was, again, to give them the opportunity to make fully informed decisions at the point of that strategic design, rather than when it's 6 or 12 months into the process and you find, actually, we've lost a container worth of goods because we didn't have a risk mitigation plan in place for a reefer being lifted at the border of Mongolia and being held there for 3 weeks.
Wow. Now, you've kind of touched on some of these, but you talked about the life cycle in your presentation. Can you give us an overview of what you mean by supply chain management life cycle?
Yeah, so you know, traditionally I would look at it from a pre-event, during event, and a post-event process, and how do we manage that? And so the typical cycle that we follow would be sort of prevention, mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. And so if I break those down, sort of prevention is about how do we identify risks and threats to our supply chain in a proactive manner. And that example that we just talked about might be a really good demonstration of that process. We're going to move to land-based transportation. Let's have a look at the risk dynamics. How can we mitigate those risk dynamics? And how can we hopefully prevent our supply chain from being exposed to those dynamics? And so, part of that might have been rerouting. Okay, we don't have resources in Mongolia. Are there different, routes that we could take? And looking at that in a proactive way before the event actually occurs. If we do it effectively, and we have the flexibility to do it, there's an opportunity to prevent the impact of it, and that's by completely avoiding that risk exposure. So the next part of the process, if we can't prevent something from happening, how do we mitigate those risks? And it's by identifying those risks effectively and developing mitigation measures and implementing those measures effectively and timely, so that they mitigate the risks as much as we possibly can. So we can't avoid the risk. There is a risk exposure. How do we minimize that risk exposure? And then if we go on to the next part, which is the preparation, we've been through the first two cycles. We've avoided what we can. We've mitigated and lowered the risk as much as we possibly can. There is a residual risk that remains. How do we prepare for that? So we accept that there is a risk. How do we prepare for it? And this is by developing the sort of response plans, and the actions that will happen should that risk materialize. And so again, these three steps are all pre-event. So if we go through those as diligently as we can, and implement those measures as effectively as we can, then we reduce the risk essentially as much as we possibly can. But the world is a changing dynamic, and we accept that there are risks. So we don't just simply stop at that point there. We think about, should that risk materialize, what is our response capability? And this is a sort of an element that we talk about a lot when we talk about, for example, security risk management. A lot of people say, yeah, okay, we've secured our facility, we've got CCTV. Well, fantastic. CCTV allows you to watch people doing whatever they're doing. If that's breaking
including
into
the
your
wrong
facility.
things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we can sit and review how they broke into our facility, forevermore. But it doesn't change the fact that they actually broke into the facility. So while different dynamics and different capabilities certainly have value to add, the response capability in that case would be, how are you going to respond when you see someone breaking into your facility? So that's, do we have security guards? Do we have police services on call? Or, what's the response capability? Do we have an in-house capability? Again, do we outsource it or what have you? And so that response planning is about identifying the risk, putting a process in place, developing those SOPs, and equally importantly, giving those assets that we are going to call upon to respond the ability to make effective, timely decisions and to implement the actions that they need to do. That comes around by training, by effective communication, and the development of SOPs and plans. And so quite often when I talk about the development of plans and sort of mitigation measures, it's important to have a results-based approach. So we could plan on every scenario and keep developing, strategies, policies, procedures, and put them in big folders, and no one will ever read them. One of the most powerful ways to implement a response capability is to give people the skills that they need, i.e. train them effectively. and give them insight and understanding of their roles and responsibilities, their level of empowerment, what decisions can they make, and what decisions do they have to refer up the chain. And also to give them a detailed understanding of what the desired end state is. Generally, we employ people through an employment and review and selection process, and we employ them because of the qualities that they bring to the table. Mm-hmm. So empower the workforce to use their own qualities that they have in abundance to make effective decisions for the well and good of the organization, which are in line with the bigger picture corporate strategic objective. And so one of the massive elements of the response capability is empowering people to implement the actions that they need to implement.
We have a minute and a half left.
Okay, I was going to say the final element is the recovery element. And the recovery element is, something that's really relevant at the moment as we, look at the COVID situation. But at that point, I'll stop.
You sure? Any closing comment? Take 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendously detailed subject area. And in our experience, a lot of leaders don't fully understand the dynamic. So my sort of parting guidance and advice would be really understand the supply chain, really understand the assets and capabilities that you have in place, communicate your strategic objectives, and empower people to fulfill the roles that you've employed them to fulfill. That's through, give them a detailed job description, inform them, give them communication tools and the resources. And that would be my sort of few final thoughts.
And on that, we've come to the end of our show. Paul, thanks very much. You gave a lot of different perspectives on supply chain, which is great. I think a lot of people, they better be paying attention. At least I hope they are. You give a lot of good information. So thank you very much for sharing your time and expertise. I really appreciate it.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
And to everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.